The age of unending night gripped Terra, shrouding its scarred landscapes in tales of ruin and resistance. Across the broken world, whispers of a rising power drifted like smoke, winding through fortress cities, techno-barbarian kingdoms, and the darkened wilds where no law but survival held sway. Some called him the Emperor, a figure as nameless as he was relentless, whose armies swept through the lands like fire through dry fields. It was said he was not merely a man, but something beyond, cloaked in light and death, his purpose drawn from the stars themselves. In Germany, these rumors were met with silence and stoic gazes. Here, in the land of iron and stone, where winters were long and the people's souls even longer, there was little room for fear. Germany was forged of harder things. Its people had survived the collapse of ages, had bent iron to their will, and built walls that rose like mountains. They held to their ancient ways and honored their own gods of metal and blood, knowing nothing beyond those walls could break what had been carved in iron. Among the silent ranks of warriors and iron mystics, there were those whose faces the annals of history would remember. Children of Germany who would one day grow to shape the galaxy itself, for good or ill. One of them, still only a shadow among the halls of Stahlburg, would come to be known as Fabius Bile, though to Germany he was still merely a clever child with a hunger for strange knowledge, eyes too curious for a world on the brink. But even among Germany's people, a change hung in the air. The warriors, with their scarred hands and eyes like smoldering coals, sensed it in the silence before dawn. The Iron Mystics, guardians of the old machines, murmured of visions, of a tide that would come to swallow the mountains and erase even the oldest strongholds of Terra's history. And within the ancient stones of Stahlburg, the last great bastion of Germany, a grim expectancy had settled. There, high upon those unyielding walls, Sturmking Erhardt von Stahl watched the skies as he had 1,000 times before. His people's faces were carved into his heart like stone etchings. Proud and fierce, forged from a history of survival against every storm Terra could unleash. He had led them through winters without end, held them together when wars had come crashing against their gates. Yet he felt it too, that sense of something greater. A shadow that loomed not just over his people, but over all of Terra itself. They said the Emperor brought unity. They said he came to end the old night and bring forth a golden dawn. But von Stahl had seen dawns turn to ash, had watched promises made and broken beneath flags as red as blood. His land, his people, they would yield to no man, no dream woven from light, no power that came to strip them of their strength. Germany would stand, as it always had, and if it must fall, then it would fall with a memory carved in iron, a story of defiance etched into Terra's bones. As the cold wind swept down from the mountains and the fires burned low in the halls of Stahlburg, the people of Germany waited. They waited as those who have seen the end of all things and chosen their path, those who would meet the coming storm with heads held high, eyes like steel. For in Germany, there was no fear of what lay beyond those walls. Only the knowledge that they would stand as they always had, against the dark, against the dawn, against the stars themselves if need be. The age of Terra was ending, and in that final chapter, Germany would not be forgotten. In the heart of Stahlburg, the great hall stood quiet and cold. The stone walls seemed to breathe, casting back whispers of battles long past. Iron braziers burned dull red, throwing shadows over the faces of Germany's leaders. Men and women forged by hardship, their features as weathered as the granite around them. At the hall's center, on a raised platform like a bastion, stood Sturmking Erhardt von Stahl, his gaze hard as tempered steel. He looked upon his people, and they looked back with fierce reverence. They knew what was coming. Scouts had ridden in hours ago, bringing word like black-winged birds, grim omens against a pale sky. The Emperor's armies had crossed the borders, marching like thunder, shaking the earth itself. Ursh had fallen. The Pan-Pacific Empire lay in ruins. Now it was Germany's turn. Von Stahl's voice was low and steady, but it cut through the heavy silence like a blade. "We are the last," he said, each word carrying the weight of every fallen fortress and comrade. "When our ancestors raised these walls, it was to guard against 1,000 enemies. They stood unyielding. So shall we." Sturmlord Albrecht Krieger, standing beside von Stahl, nodded grimly. A man of iron and muscle, Krieger's eyes were hard, his hands calloused from battle. Around him were the other warlords and iron mystics, cloaked in shadows, faces obscured. Somewhere in that darkness, the young warrior Galen Tybalt watched with a mix of pride and doubt, his hands fidgeting with the strap of his belt. Von Stahl's gaze swept the hall, lingering on each face as though he were inscribing them into memory. They come with strength we've not yet faced, he continued. Their leader wields forces we can barely understand, with warriors bred for slaughter, giants in armor that make the ground tremble. A heavy silence followed. Some shifted uneasily. Krieger's lip curled, a ghost of a sneer. Giant or not, he'll bleed like any man, he muttered. A murmur of agreement followed, low and rough. Von Stahl lifted a hand, silencing them, his eyes held in old darkness. Perhaps, he said, voice softer now, but he comes not to bleed. He comes to take what has always been ours. His gesture swept over the walls, the ancient banners heavy with dust. This fortress, this land, our bloodlines, he would see them all swallowed, erased. For a long moment, only the crackling of the braziers filled the air. Then, as if some unspoken oath passed between them, each warrior in the hall straightened, hands resting on sword hilts, the cool weight of iron at their sides. There would be no surrender. They would fight, each of them, to their last breath. Dawn broke cold and gray over Stahlburg. Fog hung thick in the valleys, coiling around the fortress walls and towers, muting the morning light. The people of Germany rose early, each one steadying themselves in the quiet hours before the day's first light truly took hold. On the highest battlements they gathered, warriors inspecting power coils, securing armor clasps, muttering low, solemn prayers to themselves. At the center stood Sturmking Erhardt von Stahl, his form stark against the pale light. He wore full battle regalia, ancient armor fitted with energy cells that hummed quietly, pulsing a faint, steady glow along the seams. His helmet rested under one arm, its worn visor bearing the etched marks of countless battles, a silent testament to the years he had defended these walls. By his side stood Eliana Stahlhardt, one of the Iron Mystics. Her robes were marked with symbols too old for most to read, and her presence brought a faint scent of oil and incense, a blend of ancient ritual and machine. Beneath her dark cloak, strands of circuitry glinted faintly, woven like veins into the fabric. She met von Stahl's gaze, her expression firm yet carrying the weight of the day to come. The machines are primed, she said softly. The energy reserves are old, but they'll hold as long as they're needed. Von Stahl nodded, his eyes fixed on the mist-covered valley below. They'll hold, he replied. He did not look at her, but his gaze stayed sharp, knowing the lives of his people rested on the old machines and on whatever power the Iron Mystics could still wring from them. Eliana hesitated, her voice subdued. My lord, there may still be a chance. If we send an emissary, perhaps. Von Stahl's expression grew steely. No, we are not Ursh or the Pan-Pacific cowards. Germany does not bow. His words held the weight of conviction, as unyielding as the fortress walls around them. Behind them, Krieger approached, his armor clanking against the stone floor. He inclined his head respectfully before speaking. The men are ready. Every warrior is at their post. Von Stahl looked out over his people, faces marked by years of hardship, hands clutching weapons passed down through generations, relics of a proud past. These were not soldiers who would yield. Each one was bound to this place by oath, by memory, and by the knowledge that retreat would mean the end of all they had defended. He raised his voice, calling down to those gathered below, soldiers and smiths, iron mystics and young fighters, even those who had only just come of age, standing now with a somber readiness in their eyes. Today, he shouted, we stand not for victory, but for remembrance. If we are to fall, let it be known we fell with strength and with honor. Germany does not surrender. The warriors answered in a shout that rang against the stone walls, a sound both fierce and resolute, raw with the certainty of those who knew their path. The Emperor's forces would come, bringing a storm like none before. But for the men and women of Stahlburg, there would be no retreat, only the fight. In the hours before noon, the last of the fog had lifted and a chill settled over the fortress. From atop the battlements, the soldiers of Germany saw their enemy at last, a vast host moving as one, stretching across the valley floor like a dark sea. Armor glinted in the weak sunlight, and towering figures moved among the ranks. Thunder warriors, each one a monstrous silhouette of power and violence, weapons charged with energies that hadn't been seen on Terra for centuries. Galen Tybalt, standing at his post along the outer wall, felt a shiver run through him. The Emperor's armies were more fearsome than even the scouts had reported. A war machine assembled with precision and brutality, each soldier a cog in a merciless advancing machine. He forced himself to steady his breathing, one hand resting on the cold metal of his plasma rifle, his finger tracing the grooves worn into its surface by generations before him. Beside him, Krieger's gaze was fixed and unblinking as he studied the approaching army. He raised his voice so that the young warriors around him could hear. "Look well," he said, voice as steady as if he were discussing a morning drill. "That is what we face today. They may come with numbers, with strength, but we have something they do not. We know these walls. We are defenders of our home." Galen swallowed hard, nodding as he absorbed Krieger's words. Yet he couldn't deny the chill of doubt creeping into his mind. What chance did they have against warriors who could move mountains, against a force driven by the Emperor himself? But looking at Krieger, the older warrior's quiet confidence anchored him. The young warriors around Galen straightened, hands gripping their weapons with renewed purpose. The Iron Mystics, Eliana among them, moved along the wall, making their final rounds. Each mystic wore the ceremonial robes that distinguished them, carrying the power cells and capacitor rods they'd spent years preserving for this day. Eliana's hands moved with practiced ease, connecting and testing the ancient energy sources embedded in the wall's defensive systems. She stopped beside Galen, looking down at his rifle. "Your aim is true, Tybalt," she asked, a hint of a smile softening her stern features. "Yes," he replied, lifting his chin. "Good," she said. Her gaze traveled briefly over the assembled warriors. "The old ones say our ancestors would offer blood before a battle, a gift to remind themselves of what they fought for." She held his gaze. "Remember that. Hold to your purpose. It will keep you steady when fear comes." Galen nodded, absorbing her words like an unspoken oath. He knew little of the Iron Mystic's ways, but he felt a strange calm settle over him as she spoke. He adjusted his rifle, taking a deep breath, letting the weight of his purpose steel his nerves. Then, suddenly, a sound ripped through the valley, a deep, resonant blast from the Emperor's war horns, shaking the stones beneath their feet. In the distance, the Emperor's army halted, as though the earth itself held its breath. Galen felt the surge of fear rise once more, but he clenched his jaw, steadying himself as he glanced at Krieger and then at Eliana. They were ready. And so, the men and women of Germany stood at the walls, hearts beating in unison as the Emperor's forces began their advance. The Emperor's war horns echoed again, a rolling thunder that seemed to reach into the stones themselves. Galen tightened his grip on his rifle, feeling the weight of history in his hands, as the Emperor's army began its steady, measured advance. The ground shuddered under the march of countless feet, armor gleaming in dull waves as the soldiers closed in, a vast sea of iron and purpose. Krieger's voice broke through the rumble. "Steady yourselves," he called. "They come to break us, but they don't know these walls. They don't know us." Across the battlements, the warriors of Germany braced themselves, each one with their weapon held firm. Many bore plasma rifles and energy pikes, relics meticulously maintained by the Iron Mystics, while others carried close combat weapons forged in the last stronghold forges. Some soldiers muttered old prayers, others merely watched the oncoming horde with a hardened calm. Eliana moved swiftly between positions, making final checks on the defense systems embedded in the walls. Each ancient mechanism thrummed to life under her hands, a glow of pale energy radiating from the power cells. She glanced up at the approaching army, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze before she focused back on her work, making sure each piece was charged, each connection secure. From his position, Galen could see the first lines of the Emperor's Thunder Warriors, massive figures armored head to toe, each step of theirs shaking the earth. They moved with precision, unstoppable and relentless. He took a deep breath, feeling his pulse quicken, then forced himself to remember Eliana's words. "Hold to your purpose. It will keep you steady." A signal flare rose from the Emperor's forces, lighting up the sky in a flash of red, and then the first salvo of fire erupted towards Stahlburg. The Emperor's opening salvo struck the outer defenses of Stahlburg in an explosion of heat and light. Shards of rock and dust rained down as the ancient walls shuddered, absorbing the initial impact. Galen staggered, steadying himself as the air filled with the sharp tang of scorched stone. "Hold your ground," Krieger's voice rang out above the din. He moved along the line, urging the warriors to stand firm, his presence like a shield among them. From her position at the wall's defensive console, Eliana activated a series of energy shields. Arcs of faint blue light flickered to life across the battlements, forming a barrier that glowed weakly but held steady. The Iron Mystics had coaxed these shields back into function from half-forgotten blueprints and a trove of rituals passed down like secrets. They might not withstand the full might of the Emperor's weapons, but they would give Germany's warriors a fighting chance. The Thunder Warriors advanced relentlessly, firing in coordinated bursts that sent waves of energy crashing against the shield. Galen's rifle kicked against his shoulder as he fired back, his shots aimed at the towering figures that were now close enough for him to make out their hulking forms, faces hidden behind dark visors, moving like war machines rather than men. Beside him, Krieger struck down an approaching enemy with a well-placed plasma bolt, a grim satisfaction lighting his eyes. "They're not invincible," he muttered, reloading with practiced speed. "Remember that." The soldiers around him shouted in defiance, rallying under the barrage. Plasma and lasfire filled the air, casting strange shadows over the battlements as Germany's defenders held their line. The shield barriers flickered as the Emperor's forces intensified their assault, each hit dimming the protective light until only a faint glow remained. Eliana's fingers flew over the console, recalibrating the power cells to stretch the shield's capacity, her face a mask of concentration. She could feel the strain in the ancient circuitry, the way the old machinery groaned under demands it was never built to sustain. Another blast struck the wall, tearing into the stone just below the battlements. Galen ducked as chunks of rock flew overhead, dust stinging his eyes. He forced himself back up, aiming his rifle at the advancing Thunder Warriors. One of his shots landed on a warrior's armor joint, and the giant staggered, its armored bulk crashing into the soldier behind it. Galen's pulse quickened with a flicker of hope. But they were coming faster now, moving over the fallen without hesitation. There was no break in their formation, no pause, only the steady rhythm of war, a mechanical, unyielding march. Krieger barked orders, directing soldiers to weaker points along the wall. He spotted Galen and gave him a nod. "Keep your fire sharp. Aim where it matters." "Yes, Sturmlord," Galen replied, the words giving him a steadiness he clung to. He lined up another shot, squeezing the trigger and watching as another advancing warrior jolted under his fire. Below, von Stahl watched the unfolding battle with grim intensity. His gaze traveled over his warriors, each one a testament to Germany's strength, each one fighting to preserve the memory of their homeland. As another barrage struck the wall, he murmured under his breath, a vow as ancient as the stones beneath his feet. Germany would not fall quietly. The shield barriers flickered as the Emperor's forces intensified their assault, each hit dimming the protective light until only a faint glow remained. Eliana's fingers flew over the console, recalibrating the power cells to stretch the shield's capacity, her face a mask of concentration. She could feel the strain in the ancient circuitry, the way the old machinery groaned under demands it was never built to sustain. Another blast struck the wall, tearing into the stone just below the battlements. Galen ducked as chunks of rock flew overhead, dust stinging his eyes. He forced himself back up, aiming his rifle at the advancing Thunder Warriors. One of his shots landed on a warrior's armor joint, and the giant staggered, its armored bulk crashing into the soldier behind it. Galen's pulse quickened with a flicker of hope. But they were coming faster now, moving over the fallen without hesitation. There was no break in their formation, no pause, only the steady rhythm of war, a mechanical, unyielding march. Krieger barked orders, directing soldiers to weaker points along the wall. He spotted Galen and gave him a nod. "Keep your fire sharp. Aim where it matters." "Yes, Sturmlord," Galen replied, the words giving him a steadiness he clung to. He lined up another shot, squeezing the trigger and watching as another advancing warrior jolted under his fire. Below, von Stahl watched the unfolding battle with grim intensity. His gaze traveled over his warriors, each one a testament to Germany's strength, each one fighting to preserve the memory of their homeland. As another barrage struck the wall, he murmured under his breath, a vow as ancient as the stones beneath his feet. Germany would not fall quietly. Another wave surged toward the walls, unbroken by the fall of their kin. The Thunder Warriors advanced without hesitation, stepping over the bodies of the fallen as if they were nothing more than debris. For every one brought down, two more took its place, each a relentless, armored colossus bearing the Emperor's will. Galen steadied his breathing, letting the rhythm of battle settle over him, his hands moving almost instinctively as he reloaded his rifle. He could hear Eliana's voice nearby, issuing orders to the Iron Mystics as they worked to stabilize the shield barriers. The power cells flickered faintly, the light guttering like a candle in a storm. "Hold the line," Krieger shouted, his voice carrying across the battlements. He fired into the advancing horde, each shot precise, striking where the Thunder Warrior's armor was weakest. Those around him took his lead, their coordinated blasts chipping away at the giants' defenses, slowing their advance step by step. A Thunder Warrior reached the base of the wall, planting something heavy against the stone, a breaching charge, ancient and deadly. Galen's heart stuttered as he saw the device flash to life, a red light blinking in rapid succession. He shouted, his voice ragged, "They're planting charges!" Krieger's eyes narrowed as he took in the threat. "Focus fire on them. Don't let them breach." The defenders redirected their shots, targeting the Thunder Warriors attempting to set the charges. Plasma and last fire lit up the battlements in a furious assault, forcing the giants back from the wall, some stumbling, others dropping as the concentrated fire overwhelmed even their heavy armor. Galen fired until his rifle grew hot in his hands, the energy pack nearly depleted. The explosive device remained attached to the wall, its red light a glaring warning. Desperation surged through him, and he turned to Eliana. "Can the barriers hold if they detonate that charge?" Eliana's face was tight with strain, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not for long." As he looked into her eyes, Galen realized that the real battle had only just begun. The breaching charge glowed with a menacing, pulsing light that seemed to quicken, each flash counting down toward the inevitable. Galen clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed on the device. Around him, the defenders were holding back the Thunder Warriors with everything they had, but the relentless tide pressed on, inching closer to the wall. Krieger's voice cut through the noise, a sharp command. "Get that charge off the wall." Galen took a step forward, gripping his rifle, but Eliana seized his arm, her eyes fierce. "You'll never reach it in time." She looked toward the Iron Mystics gathered along the wall. "Bring me the capacitor rod," she called out, her voice steady despite the chaos. One of the Mystics handed her a long metal rod, its tip crackling with stored energy. Eliana's expression hardened as she grasped it, and without hesitation she turned to Krieger. "Cover me." Krieger nodded, motioning for the soldiers around him to form a protective barrier, their fire intensifying as they focused on keeping the Thunder Warriors back from the wall. With a deep breath, Eliana sprinted toward the breaching charge, the capacitor rod held firmly in her hands. Galen watched, his heart pounding as she reached the device. Eliana jammed the rod directly against the charge, releasing a surge of energy that crackled and hissed. The capacitor's power clashed with the charge, forcing the device's circuitry into overload. For a tense moment, the light on the charge flickered, and then, with a sputter, it faded, the device shorting out and going dark. A cheer rose from the defenders, a brief spark of victory amidst the onslaught. But the Thunder Warriors continued their advance, undeterred by the failure of their explosives. They pressed forward, the next line already nearing the wall. Eliana stumbled back, the spent capacitor rod falling from her hand. Galen rushed forward to support her, relief and admiration mixing in his gaze. She met his eyes, a weary smile tugging at her lips. "This isn't over, Tybalt. Stay vigilant." Together, they turned to face the next wave, their resolve unbroken, even as the shadows of the Emperor's war machine closed in around them. The Thunder Warriors regrouped, and their assault came with renewed fury. More breaching charges appeared in their hands, heavy and ominous. Behind them, a new line of soldiers advanced, standard troops clad in armor that, while not as imposing as the Thunder Warriors, was still formidable. They moved in perfect coordination, like cogs in a relentless grinding machine. Krieger shouted fresh orders, his voice hoarse but unyielding. "Focus fire on the charges. Don't let them reach the walls." The defenders took aim, their weapons flaring with plasma and last fire, striking down any enemy who came too close. But the Thunder Warriors adapted, shields raised, absorbing much of the fire as they pushed forward, step by brutal step. Each blow against them seemed only to harden their resolve. One of the breaching charges struck close, fastening to the lower wall with a magnetic lock, and there was no time to defuse it. The red light blinked furiously as a surge of energy burst from it in a concussive blast, shaking the fortress to its core. Galen stumbled as the shockwave sent a ripple through the walls, stone splintering and cracking. A breach opened in the wall, smoke and dust billowing out. Thunder Warriors surged toward it, their hulking forms taking advantage of the newly created gap. Krieger's voice rang out again, pulling the defenders together with a single word: "Hold!" Galen saw the breach and knew what it meant. Without hesitation, he sprinted to the fractured edge, his rifle aimed steady. "They're coming through," he shouted, his voice swallowed by the roar of battle. He fired into the oncoming mass, each shot aimed to slow them, to buy Germany precious seconds. Warriors rushed to his side, taking up defensive positions to plug the gap. The clash was brutal. Close quarters now, plasma blades meeting metal, the air thick with smoke and sparks. Krieger joined them, wielding his power axe with practiced precision, cutting down any Thunder Warrior who dared approach. His presence was like a wall in itself, fierce and unyielding. "Stand together," he shouted. "This is where we make our stand." With Krieger at their side, Galen and the others pushed back, fighting with a desperation born of loyalty and pride. They fought for every inch of ground, the wall itself a testament to their courage and resolve. The breach filled with smoke and blood, a narrow, brutal battlefield where the warriors of Germany met the Emperor's forces in a desperate struggle. The confined space became a crucible. Each inch of ground gained or lost paid for with lives. Plasma blades and axes clashed in flashes of searing light, illuminating the hardened faces of defenders and the implacable visors of the Thunder Warriors. Galen fought shoulder to shoulder with Krieger, the older warrior's movements a whirlwind of practiced, deadly precision. Together, they cut down the first wave of Thunder Warriors pushing through the breach, but more surged forward, a tide that seemed endless. Galen's muscles burned, but he forced himself onward, each strike and shot driven by the simple truth that there was nowhere to retreat to, no home left if they faltered. Beside him, Aeliana rejoined the fray, her robes scorched and dirt-streaked, her gaze fierce. She wielded a charged staff, an ancient relic from the Iron Mystic's vaults, each strike emitting a pulse of energy that repelled even the heavy armor-clad giants. She moved with a calm purpose, deflecting blows and taking down warriors with a precision that seemed almost otherworldly. Krieger cast a quick glance at her, nodding in approval. "You're a force today, Aeliana." Her eyes didn't leave the enemy. For Germany, there is no other way. Another Thunder Warrior surged through, raising a weapon charged with energy. Galen saw it too late. The warrior swung, and the blast struck the battlements just inches from him, the explosion throwing him backward. He hit the stone floor, dazed, his ears ringing, the world a blur. Through the haze, he saw Krieger reaching down, hauling him back to his feet. "Stay with us, Tybalt. We're not done." Galen nodded, swallowing his pain, regaining his balance. Around him, the defenders closed ranks, forming a new line even as the enemy pressed harder. They were running out of space, but still, they held, refusing to give an inch more than the enemy could take by force. In the chaos, von Stahl's voice thundered from atop the wall, cutting through the battle. "Germany will not fall. Stand firm, warriors of Stahlburg. Let them know what it costs to challenge us." The words rippled through the defenders, igniting a fierce determination. They locked shields and aimed weapons, drawing strength from each other from the very walls around them, and pushed back with everything they had left. The defenders' renewed strength held the line, a stubborn wall of iron and resolve against the Emperor's relentless tide. Blood and smoke mingled in the air, the acrid stench of battle thick as stone dust filled the breach, coating the skin of every warrior in grime. Still, the soldiers of Germany stood, each one a pillar against the coming storm, their faces hard with defiance. Krieger swung his power axe in wide, lethal arcs, cutting down any Thunder Warrior who dared step through the breach. His breaths were labored, his movements slowing, but his focus was unbroken. The man fought as if every blow could hold back the end itself. Galen matched his stance beside him, his rifle trained on the figures charging toward them, each shot carefully placed to weaken the enemy's advance. From her position along the wall, Aeliana struggled to stabilize the defenses, her hands shaking with exhaustion as she adjusted power coils and sealed energy leaks. She could feel the strain in the fortress systems, the very mechanisms themselves beginning to fracture under the relentless onslaught. It wouldn't be long before the energy reserves gave out completely, and when they did, the barriers would collapse, leaving Stahlburg entirely exposed. Another blast from the Emperor's forces struck the upper wall, sending chunks of stone raining down on the defenders. Galen ducked instinctively, shielding his face as dust clouded the air. When he looked up, he saw a new wave approaching. Standard troops mixed with Thunder Warriors, advancing in tight formations, shields locked in a phalanx. "They're closing in," Galen shouted to Krieger. Krieger only grinned, the glint of battle madness in his eyes. "Then we hold until they break. Or we do." He raised his axe, preparing to meet the advancing force head-on. Eliana moved to Galen's side, her staff glowing faintly, the last of its charge nearly depleted. "We're almost out of time," she said, her voice steady despite the urgency in her eyes. "When the barriers fall, they'll push us from all sides." Galen felt the weight of her words, the finality of them settling in his chest like a stone. He took a breath, steadying himself. "Then we make sure they remember us," he said, his gaze fierce. As the enemy reached the breach, the defenders braced themselves, each one ready to give everything they had. For Germany, for their brothers and sisters beside them, for the memory of Stahlburg. This, they knew, was where they would be remembered. The Emperor's forces surged forward, filling the breach with bodies, armor, and the clang of weapons. Plasma bolts and energy blasts flared in bursts of blue and red, searing through the thick haze of dust. The walls of Stahlburg shook under the strain, stone crumbling underfoot as the battle intensified, the fortress itself seeming to groan beneath the weight of the clash. Galen fired into the mass, his rifle's energy pack running low, each shot carrying the weight of desperation. He fought like a man possessed, feeling his arms burn as he reloaded and fired again, refusing to relent. A figure beside him staggered, a young warrior barely out of training, his armor splintered from a Thunder Warrior's blow. Galen grabbed his arm, pulling him back into the ranks, nodding reassurance before turning to face the next threat. Von Stahl's voice echoed down from the battlements, strong and unwavering. "For every step they take, make them bleed twice over. Let no foe pass unchallenged." The defenders took up the cry, a fierce, ragged chant rising from their throats as they held their line, refusing to falter. Krieger fought at the forefront, his power axe slicing through enemy after enemy, his face a mask of grim determination. The men around him found courage in his presence, rallying to his side as they repelled wave after wave, their shields and bodies blocking the relentless advance. But then, a low hum filled the air, a new sound cutting through the chaos. Galen glanced over his shoulder, his blood running cold. The Emperor's army had brought siege engines forward, massive war machines that loomed in the distance, their silhouettes emerging from the smoke. These were unlike anything Germany had ever faced. Machines of metal and fire, their weapon ports glowing with lethal energy, ready to rain destruction upon the fortress. Eliana's eyes widened as she saw the siege engines. She whispered, almost to herself, "Those walls won't hold against that kind of firepower." Krieger's face hardened as he caught sight of the approaching engines. "Then we hold them here," he said, his voice low, fierce. "If this is our end, we'll make it one they'll never forget." The war machines loomed closer, their hulking forms casting shadows across the battlefield, their weapons trained on Stahlburg's ancient walls. The ground shook beneath their weight, each step a promise of annihilation. The Emperor's siege engines, massive constructs of iron and energy, bristled with heavy weaponry, cannons designed to tear through fortresses, and missile batteries primed to unleash devastation. Galen felt the vibrations through his boots as the machines took position, their weapon ports glowing ominously. He clenched his teeth, glancing at Krieger and Eliana, their expressions mirrors of his own. Fierce, unyielding, but tinged with the heavy knowledge of what was to come. Eliana's voice was tense but steady as she addressed the warriors nearby. "If their fire hits the inner wall, it'll collapse. We won't have anything left to defend." She looked at Krieger, her gaze resolute. "We need to disable those engines." Krieger nodded, determination hardening his features. "Then we take them out before they get close enough." Without another word, He called for a handful of soldiers to join him, volunteers who understood the grim nature of their mission. Galen stepped forward without hesitation, meeting Krieger's gaze. "I'll go with you." Krieger nodded, a brief look of pride flickering in his eyes. "Stay close, Tybalt. We only get one chance at this." With a few quick words to Eliana, the small group gathered their remaining explosive charges, salvaging what power they could from the fortress's reserves. They would need to get in close, right under the looming siege engines, to have any hope of damaging their armored hulls. As the group descended from the wall, Eliana's hand caught Galen's arm, stopping him. She pressed a small power cell into his hand, her fingers lingering briefly over his. "For your rifle," she said, voice low, "make every shot count." He nodded, feeling the weight of her unspoken words. "We'll return," he promised, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Together, Krieger, Galen, and the small band of warriors broke from the safety of the walls, moving low and fast across the rubble-strewn battlefield toward the looming forms of the siege engines. Each step took them further from the safety of the fortress, closer to the enemy's heart. And still, Stahlburg stood behind them, a silent witness to their courage as they ran into the shadow of the Emperor's war machines. The small band of warriors moved swiftly across the battered ground, the rumble of the siege engines drowning out the clash of the larger battle behind them. Each step brought them closer to the hulking machines that loomed above, massive and unfeeling, their weapon mounts swiveling toward Stahlburg with mechanical precision. The air was thick with the scent of oil and scorched metal, the heat from the engines radiating like an open furnace. Krieger motioned for them to halt, crouching low behind a jagged fragment of wall. He scanned the terrain, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Our charges won't penetrate their outer armor directly," he murmured, keeping his voice low. "We'll need to target their weapon joints and power coils. If we're close enough, the blast might cripple their firing mechanisms." Galen glanced at the nearest siege engine, its immense bulk blocking out the sky. The exposed coils along its flank hummed with raw energy, casting an eerie light over the ground. It was a weak point, but reaching it would require them to move through open ground under heavy guard. "3 engines, 3 teams," Krieger continued. "We set the charges, then pull back to the fortress. Do not linger." He fixed his gaze on Galen, his voice firm. "No heroics, Tybalt. Get in, get out. Understood?" Galen nodded, tightening his grip on the rifle, the weight of the power cell Eliana had given him grounding him. "Understood, Sturmlord." Without another word, Krieger signaled for the teams to split. Galen followed his group, moving silently across the open ground, every step in sync with his heartbeat. As they neared the first siege engine, he could make out the hulking shapes of its defenders, Emperor's soldiers, armored and vigilant, guarding the machine's vulnerable points. The group took cover, watching the patrols. One soldier raised his rifle, aiming at the nearest guard. Krieger shook his head, holding up a hand. "Quietly," he whispered. "We don't bring the rest of them down on us until we have to." They waited for a gap, a breath of vulnerability in the patrol's rhythm. Then, like shadows, they advanced, creeping along the base of the machine. Galen's heart thundered in his chest, each step bringing him closer to the humming coils. He reached the power joint, his fingers quickly fastening the charge, securing it against the armor with a focused precision. But then a voice shouted from above, sharp and urgent. Galen looked up, meeting the gaze of an enemy soldier who had spotted them. There was no more time for stealth. The shout cut through the air, followed by the blare of an alarm. In an instant, the Emperor's soldiers turned toward them, weapons raised, and the brief silence shattered into chaos. Galen pressed down the activator on the charge, feeling it hum to life against the hull of the siege engine. Beside him, Krieger barked orders, his voice steady despite the growing threat. "Charges set! Fall back to the fortress!" Krieger shouted, swinging his power axe in a wide arc to keep the advancing soldiers at bay. The defenders moved with lethal precision, covering each other as they tried to block Germany's warriors from reaching their targets. Galen fired into the approaching troops, his shots landing true, but more enemies moved in to take their place, closing the gap. The charge was armed, but they'd need a clean escape to detonate it. "Go! I'll cover you!" Galen yelled to the nearest warrior, who nodded, retreating back toward the fortress wall. Krieger's hand gripped Galen's shoulder briefly, pulling him back. You're not staying here alone, Tybalt. Move. Together, they fought their way toward cover, weaving between the hulls of the siege engines. The defenders pressed in from all sides, bolts of plasma and last fire filling the air as the teams retreated, each step a hard-won victory. Behind them, one of the charges detonated, a blast that shook the ground, lighting up the battlefield in a flare of heat and fire. The explosion tore through the closest siege engine, splitting metal and rupturing the power coils in a fiery burst. The war machine groaned as it faltered, its firing mechanisms grinding to a halt. Galen stole a glance over his shoulder, watching the giant collapse, but there was no time to celebrate. Two more engines loomed, unharmed, their weapons still trained on Stahlburg. Krieger urged the remaining teams forward, rallying them with a fierce determination. The other charges. Detonate them now. In the cover of the smoke and debris, the warriors moved, Galen among them, running back toward the fortress as the ground trembled beneath their feet. He heard the second explosion behind him, a thunderous crack as the second engine fell, flames licking the sky. But the third siege engine still stood, its massive silhouette rising through the smoke like an unbreakable shadow. The third siege engine remained, an iron behemoth rising above the battlefield, its cannons aimed squarely at Stahlburg's walls. The defenders' charges had crippled two of the machines, but this last engine stood unharmed, an implacable symbol of the Emperor's might. Galen's lungs burned as he ran through the haze, glancing back at the fortress, its outer walls cracked and battered, barely holding together after the last assault. Krieger's voice came through the smoke, sharp and commanding. "Who has the last charge?" One of the warriors stepped forward, clutching the explosive device. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but he held the charge steady, a testament to his resolve. Krieger nodded, taking it from him with a steady hand. "We take it in close," Krieger said, turning to Galen. "There's no time for another retreat. We'll have to plant it ourselves." Galen understood immediately, the weight of Krieger's words settling over him. This would be a final push, one that offered no escape. He nodded, meeting Krieger's gaze, seeing the iron resolve in the older man's eyes. "Then let's finish it," Galen replied, his voice firm. Without hesitation, they moved toward the engine, each step a conscious act of defiance. The remaining Emperor's soldiers fired as they advanced, and Galen and Krieger weaved through the onslaught, their every move focused and deliberate. The world shrank to the sound of footsteps and distant echoes, each breath filled with the scent of scorched earth and steel. They reached the base of the siege engine, its massive legs rooted in the ground like iron columns. Krieger motioned to a weak spot in the machine's structure, a cluster of energy conduits that powered its main weapon. He began to set the charge, his hands steady even as enemy fire rained down around them. But before Krieger could complete his work, a shadow fell over them, a thunder warrior, his massive form blocking their path to retreat. His armor bore the insignia of the Emperor, a silent symbol of the might they faced. Galen's heart raced as the thunder warrior raised his weapon, his dark visor fixed on them. This was their last moment, their final stand. Without a word, Krieger turned to Galen, his face set in grim determination. "Detonate the charge when I give the signal, and don't look back." Krieger lunged forward, drawing the Thunder Warrior's attention, giving Galen the only chance he needed. Krieger charged at the Thunder Warrior, his power axe swinging in a deadly arc. Sparks flew as it struck armor, carving a jagged line across the massive soldier's plating. The Thunder Warrior staggered but recovered swiftly, turning with an almost mechanical precision, striking Krieger with a blow that sent him reeling. Krieger stumbled, blood trickling down his face, yet he did not fall. His eyes burned with defiance as he struck again, each swing a testament to the years he had dedicated to defending Germany. For a moment, it seemed as if his sheer will alone could match the strength of the towering giant before him. "Go," he shouted to Galen, his voice raw. "Complete the mission. Don't look back." Galen's heart pounded as he pressed down on the charge, feeling the device hum to life beneath his hands. Every instinct urged him to stay, to help, but he knew what Krieger's command meant. They had come here to end this, to cripple the siege engine, even if it meant Krieger's life. With one last look, Galen turned and ran, his fingers trembling as he tightened his grip on the detonator. Behind him, Krieger's voice rang out over the clash of metal, a defiant cry that filled the air like the final roar of a storm. For Germany! Galen pressed the detonator. The explosion tore through the siege engine, ripping its structure apart in a blinding burst of light and heat. The Thunder Warrior and Krieger were lost in the blast as the machine collapsed, sending smoke and debris into the sky. The battlefield fell into a stunned silence as the Emperor's forces reeled from the sudden loss, confusion rippling through their ranks. Galen rose from where he'd fallen, staring back at the smoldering wreckage. Krieger was gone, his final stand an echo on the wind. But in that moment, his name became legend. For a mortal soldier to have faced down the Emperor's Thunder Warriors and held the line so fiercely was a feat few would believe, but none would ever forget. With a heavy heart, Galen turned towards Stahlburg, the battered fortress still standing amid the ruins. The defenders had lost much, but they had defied the odds, if only for a day. Germany had endured, and the memory of Krieger's sacrifice would live on in the heart of every warrior who had fought beside him. Galen staggered back to the fortress walls, his limbs aching and his vision blurred from the smoke and dust that clung to the battlefield. Around him, the defenders of Stahlburg were regrouping, voices quiet as they processed the loss, yet their eyes remained fierce. They had seen Krieger's sacrifice, the cost he had paid to cripple the enemy's siege engines, and it filled them with a defiant pride. Eliana was waiting by the gates, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her face unreadable but her eyes distant. When she saw Galen approaching, relief flickered across her features, and she stepped forward. "The siege engines? 2 of them are destroyed," he said, voice rough, exhaustion weighing each word. "The last one, Krieger took it down. He gave us everything he had." Eliana lowered her head, a hand pressed over her heart in silent respect. "He held the line," she murmured, "just as he promised." She looked back up at Galen, her expression hardening. "We can't waste the chance he's given us. The Emperor's forces are momentarily scattered, but they'll recover. We need every soldier ready to defend the breaches." Galen nodded, rallying what strength he had left. He looked over the warriors who had survived the initial assault, their armor dented and bloodstained, faces set with grim determination. They were weary, yes, but they still stood, and the memory of Krieger's final act gave them a renewed resolve. "Listen up," Galen called out, his voice echoing off the walls. "We've lost much, but we've given them something to remember. They thought we'd be crushed, yet here we are, still standing. So long as these walls hold, so long as a single one of us breathes, we defend this place." The warriors raised their fists, a unified, defiant response that cut through the silence. Eliana turned to him, a slight nod acknowledging his words. "We'll prepare the remaining defenses. With luck, the worst of their artillery is done for." Together, they moved back to the ramparts, side by side, preparing for whatever the Emperor's forces would throw at them next. For Stahlburg. For Krieger. For Germany. The sky above Stahlburg darkened as storm clouds gathered, blotting out the morning light. The fortress walls were battered, scorched, and riddled with cracks, yet the warriors of Germany stood firm, their gazes fixed on the enemy beyond. The Emperor's forces were regrouping, and it was only a matter of time before the next assault would begin. Galen leaned against the inner wall, catching his breath, his rifle resting against his leg. The weight of Krieger's absence hung heavily over him. The older warrior's final act had bought them precious time, but the price of that sacrifice was one he felt with every heartbeat. Eliana approached him, her face set with quiet resolve. She had cast off her ceremonial robes, now clad in the same scarred armor as the warriors around her, her staff at her side, its energy cells sparking faintly. "We've done all we can to shore up the defenses," she said, her voice low. "But you know as well as I do that the next wave will likely reach the heart of Stahlburg." Galen nodded, wiping grime from his face. "We'll make them fight for every step. If they want these walls, they'll have to pay in blood." He glanced at the remaining soldiers, their faces lined with exhaustion and the weight of what they'd seen, yet still they stood ready. Eliana's gaze softened, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Galen, we've lost too many. Even our strongest defenses are barely holding. This fortress won't survive another full-scale attack." Galen clenched his jaw, feeling the sting of her words, though he knew she spoke the truth. Still, the thought of surrender left a bitter taste in his mouth. "Germany doesn't surrender, Eliana. We fight to the end. That's what Krieger would have wanted." She nodded slowly, understanding but not entirely agreeing. Then we'll need to use everything we have left. She gestured to the Iron Mystics gathered nearby, who were working in tense silence, adjusting power coils, rerouting energy, and drawing symbols across the inner walls with chalk and oil. Eliana met Galen's gaze, a glint of finality in her eyes. There are older devices, forbidden technologies. They're volatile, but they may give us the strength we need. Galen hesitated, understanding the risks, but knowing they had few choices left. Whatever it takes, he said, his voice steady. We use every tool, every weapon, for Stahlburg. Together, they turned toward the fortress's heart, where Germany's last line of defense would be prepared. Inside Stahlburg's inner sanctum, a hidden chamber lay beneath layers of stone and iron, a place rarely entered even by the Iron Mystics. It was filled with relics from a forgotten age, devices encased in dust and shadows, each one a fragment of a time when Terra had been a place of innovation and light. Now these relics were all that stood between Stahlburg and annihilation. Eliana led Galen into the chamber, her movements cautious, reverent. The Iron Mystics had guarded these devices for centuries, forbidden by ancient decrees from tampering with them, devices that had once been seen as sacred, yet dangerously unpredictable. She stopped before a large cylindrical object, its surface etched with runes and sigils worn down by time. Its core thrummed faintly, as though even dormant, it was aware of their presence. "This is an energy disruptor," Eliana murmured, almost to herself. It was designed to send out a pulse that scrambles all nearby technology, even armor and weaponry. If we activate it, it may disable the Emperor's forces long enough for us to strike, but... She hesitated, glancing at Galen. There's no guarantee it will leave us unaffected. Galen regarded the device, feeling a thrill of fear and awe. It was a weapon that could level the field in an instant or bring about their ruin. He could feel Krieger's absence keenly in this moment. His old mentor's steady resolve would have been a comfort in a decision like this, but he had seen what they were up against. He had seen the strength and relentlessness of the Thunder Warriors, the war engines, and the Emperor's soldiers. If Stahlburg had any hope left, it was here, within these walls and these ancient machines. "We use it," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever happens, we owe it to those who fell defending these walls." Eliana nodded, though her expression was conflicted. "I'll need time to power it up and adjust the output. If it overloads, it could detonate everything within the inner walls." "Do it," Galen replied, a fierce determination in his eyes. "Krieger gave his life so we could stand here now. If we're to join him, we do it fighting." Eliana placed her hands on the disruptor, her fingers moving over the controls, coaxing the device to life. Its core pulsed brighter, casting an eerie glow across the chamber, a light both beautiful and ominous. "Prepare the warriors," Eliana said, her voice calm but edged with urgency. "When this activates, it will only be a matter of moments before the Emperor's forces regroup." Galen nodded, turning to leave the chamber, his heart pounding with purpose. Outside, the defenders were gathering, readying their weapons, waiting for his word. He took a deep breath, knowing that this would be their final stand. "Warriors of Stahlburg," he called out, his voice carrying through the stone corridors. "Today we fight with the strength of our ancestors, with the fury of those who have fallen. We are the last line, the last hope. Let our stand here echo through the ages, so they know that Germany did not fall quietly." A roar rose up from the assembled warriors, a sound that reverberated through the ancient walls, filling every stone and shadow. The roar of the warriors faded into a tense silence as they took their positions, each one bracing for the inevitable onslaught. The air was thick with anticipation, every soldier gripping their weapon, eyes locked on the outer walls where the Emperor's forces gathered in formation. An unyielding line of armored bodies and siege equipment ready to breach Stahlburg's last defenses. Galen returned to the inner wall, standing shoulder to shoulder with those who had survived the earlier attacks. The exhaustion was visible in their eyes, but so was something stronger, a fierce, unbroken will. These were warriors who had seen their comrades fall, who had fought through blood and fire, and who stood now with nothing left to lose. He looked across the battlements and caught Eliana's eye, her face lit by the eerie glow of the energy disruptor she had coaxed back to life. The device pulsed steadily, casting a cold light across the defenders and filling the air with a low hum. She gave him a slight nod, signaling that everything was ready. All that remained was the signal. Then, with a suddenness that made Galen's blood freeze, the Emperor's forces began their advance. The ground trembled under the weight of the Thunder Warriors and their armored battalions, a relentless wave of iron and fire. Lasfire and plasma bolts arced toward the walls, lighting up the stone in bursts of color and heat. The defenders fired back, their shots picking off the smaller troops, even as the Thunder Warriors pressed forward, their massive forms indifferent to the hail of gunfire. "Hold steady," Galen shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Let them come in close." His words grounded the defenders, their focus sharpening as they waited. The Emperor's forces were nearly at the breach now, pushing through with unstoppable momentum, their dark visors and polished armor gleaming with a cruel intensity. The fortress walls shuddered with every impact, stones splintering under the relentless barrage. Just as the first Thunder Warrior reached the breach, Aeliana threw the final lever, activating the energy disruptor. The device released a pulse, a flash of blinding light accompanied by a deep, resonant hum that rippled out from the heart of the fortress. In an instant, the Emperor's soldiers faltered. Weapons flickered, armor systems stuttered, and the relentless march of the Thunder Warriors slowed as the pulse washed over them, scrambling their circuits and shorting out their power sources. "Now!" Galen roared, and the defenders surged forward, striking at the stunned soldiers, their weapons aimed at vulnerable joints and weakened armor. The tide of battle shifted as Germany's warriors pressed their advantage, each blow fueled by desperation and fury, a final act of defiance. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Stahlburg could withstand the Emperor's wrath. The defenders surged, striking hard and fast, their weapons finding weak spots in the stuttering armor of the Emperor's forces. Thunder Warriors, momentarily paralyzed by the disruptor pulse, staggered as they attempted to reactivate their systems, their towering forms now vulnerable. The air filled with the clash of metal, the crack of lasfire, and the shouts of warriors seizing their fleeting chance. Galen moved among the defenders, his rifle blazing as he aimed for the exposed joints of a Thunder Warrior's armor. Each shot landed with deadly precision, his hands steady as he took down one of the giants that had terrorized them for so long. Around him, soldiers shouted in defiant triumph, rallying as they struck at the disoriented invaders. It was a sight none of them had thought they'd live to see, the mighty Thunder Warriors stumbling, struggling as Germany's defenders struck back. But the disruptor's effect was short-lived. Just as the defenders began to push the Emperor's troops back, the power in the pulse weakened. The faint glow around the disruptor flickered, its hum stuttering, signaling that its charge was nearly spent. Galen glanced at Aeliana, who was frantically adjusting the controls, her face tight with concentration. She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw a grim acknowledgement of the inevitable. "It's running out," she called, her voice barely audible above the sounds of battle. "The power cells can't hold it any longer." The Emperor's soldiers began to recover, their systems reactivating, the hum of their war machines growing louder as they regained control. Thunder Warriors rose to their full height, their movements smoother and more assured with each passing second. One by one, they reoriented, their visors locking onto the defenders with renewed malice. The brief moment of advantage slipped through Galen's fingers like sand. He shouted to his warriors, "Fall back to the inner walls. Regroup. We're not finished yet." The defenders scrambled, their brief surge turning into a desperate retreat as the Emperor's soldiers advanced with renewed strength. The disruptor's final hum died out, leaving only silence in its wake, a silence soon filled with the heavy footfalls of Thunder Warriors and the rumble of siege engines powering up once more. Galen and the others fell back, regrouping behind the battered inner wall, a last line of defense that now bore the scars of every assault. He raised his rifle, his gaze steady, his heart pounding, but his spirit unbroken. They would hold here, in this final line, for as long as they could. The defenders took their positions behind the inner wall, shoulders pressed against the cold stone, each of them breathing heavily, but unwilling to show the fear simmering beneath their battle-hardened exteriors. The Emperor's forces had regrouped, their lines reformed, and the rumble of siege engines was growing louder, inching closer, like the slow turning of a blade toward the heart of Stahlburg. Galen glanced around him, meeting the eyes of his fellow warriors. Their faces were smeared with blood and dust, exhaustion etched into every line, yet each pair of eyes glinted with the same fierce resolve. They all knew what this last stand meant. There was no need for words. For Germany, for each other, they would hold. Eliana joined him at the front, her once pristine armor battered, the faint glow of the disruptor's final burst fading from her robes. She cast a quick look at Galen, her face set in a mask of calm, though he could see the weight of the battle pressing down on her. "There's nothing left to give," she said, her voice low. "Every power cell is drained, every last reserve has been used." Galen nodded, tightening his grip on his rifle. "Then we fight with what we have." He lifted his voice to address the warriors along the line. "We stand here, for each other, for our fallen. Every inch they take will cost them." As the Emperor's forces drew near, a deafening roar split the air, a signal from the Emperor's own war horns. The final assault had begun. Thunder Warriors led the charge, their massive forms striding through the rubble, weapons raised and gleaming in the dim light. Behind them, rank upon rank of the Emperor's soldiers marched with unbreakable unity, a wave of iron and fury aimed at the fortress's last line. The defenders met the charge with a hail of gunfire. Plasma bolts streaked through the air, last fire cracked against armor, and even the ancient cannons mounted on the walls fired until their barrels glowed red with heat. The first lines of the Emperor's troops staggered as the defenders' fire found its mark, but the assault did not falter. Thunder Warriors took the lead, absorbing the brunt of the damage, their armor scarred but unbroken. One of the giants reached the wall, and with a single brutal strike, it splintered a section of the stone. Galen fired, his shot striking the warrior in the exposed neck joint. The Thunder Warrior reeled but did not fall, swinging back with lethal force. The air filled with smoke and the screams of the wounded as the assault grew closer, each second more desperate than the last. Eliana was beside him, her staff raised, deflecting strikes with practiced skill. "We will give them a memory to haunt them," she whispered, voice fierce, her gaze unwavering. The defenders pressed on, each knowing that this was the end, but determined that if they were to fall, they would make Stahlburg's last stand a legend. The clash at the inner wall intensified as the Emperor's forces pressed forward, a relentless tide that refused to break. The defenders of Stahlburg fought with everything they had, their weapons flashing in arcs of light against the darkened stone. Each blast of last fire, each swing of an axe, was driven by the shared understanding that this was their last stand. There would be no retreat, no fallback plan. Only the line they held and the memory they would leave behind. Galen fired until his rifle ran hot, his every movement fueled by a fierce determination to honor Krieger's sacrifice. Beside him, Eliana fought with unwavering resolve, her staff glowing faintly as she struck down enemy after enemy, her expression focused, almost serene. Together they anchored the last defense, holding the line as Thunder Warriors and the Emperor's soldiers pressed in from all sides. A massive impact struck the wall behind them, sending cracks through the stone, and several defenders staggered back, clutching their weapons as rubble fell around them. The Thunder Warriors moved forward, their towering forms casting long shadows over the battlements as they breached the inner defenses, closing in like predators sensing the end of a hunt. "Brace yourselves," Galen shouted, rallying those who remained. "Hold the line for as long as it takes." The warriors formed a close ring, shields raised, weapons ready, facing the advancing enemies with the grim acceptance of those who know the odds but refuse to yield. They fought shoulder to shoulder, each one covering the other's weakness, a final act of unity that would make their stand legendary. Plasma bolts and last fire lit up the stone, casting strange, ghostly shadows as they struck down one enemy, only for another to take its place. Eliana's voice rose above the clash. "If this is the end," she called, her voice fierce, "let it be one that echoes through history. Let them know that Germany never bowed." A cheer rippled through the defenders, a fierce, guttural cry that filled the air, as if the very stones of Stahlburg bore witness to their resolve. And in that moment, as the enemy closed in, the defenders fought like legends, refusing to give even an inch. The Emperor's forces surged into the breach, and the inner sanctum became a brutal, chaotic melee. Stahlburg's defenders were outnumbered, Yet they fought with a ferocity that belied their dwindling ranks. Galen swung his rifle like a cudgel, its power cell exhausted, the weapon now a blunt instrument in a fight where every strike mattered. A Thunder Warrior bore down on him, armored bulk, blotting out the light as it raised its weapon. Galen ducked under the swing, slamming his rifle into the giant's knee joint. The warrior stumbled, giving Galen just enough time to drive his knife into the exposed wiring beneath the armor's plating. The Thunder Warrior fell with a crash, and Galen staggered back, breathless but alive. Around him, the defenders were holding their own, each one striking with precision honed by years of war. Aeliana fought nearby, her movements swift and controlled, her staff a blur as she deflected blows and landed counterstrikes against their enemies. Her face was streaked with blood, her robes torn, yet her gaze was calm, almost otherworldly. A sudden impact rocked the chamber, and Galen looked up to see another wave of Thunder Warriors advancing. Their hulking forms moved methodically, relentless even in the face of Stahlburg's desperate defense. Galen's heart sank as he saw the sheer number of them, each one an unstoppable force, their dark visors gleaming with cold intent. "We're losing ground," Aeliana shouted, her voice cutting through the din. "Fall back to the heart of the sanctum." The defenders, those who still stood, withdrew deeper into the inner chamber, their ranks thin but unbroken. They regrouped, forming a tighter circle around the innermost part of the fortress, a last redoubt, a place untouched by any invader for centuries. The ancient banners of Germany hung on the walls, worn and faded, yet they seemed to pulse with life, a reminder of all they fought for. Galen took his place at the front, his gaze sweeping over the warriors around him, each one battered and bloodied but resolute. "This is it," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "We hold this ground, no matter the cost." The Emperor's forces closed in, filling the sanctum with their towering forms, and as the final clash began, the defenders of Stahlburg stood like the walls themselves, unyielding, prepared to give all they had for the memory of Germany. Through the thick haze of battle, a new figure emerged, moving with an elegance that felt almost surreal amid the brutal carnage within Stahlburg's walls. Tall and resplendent in golden armor that gleamed with an inner light, he walked with a calm, deliberate stride, his every step echoing with a quiet authority that parted the chaos around him. A single exquisitely crafted spear rested in his grip, its blade glinting with an otherworldly sharpness. The defender's breath caught. This was no Thunder Warrior or faceless soldier. This was something else, something rarer and far deadlier. A custodian, one of the Emperor's personal guardians. The custodian's movements seemed almost languid as he advanced, his spear weaving in a slow, graceful arc. He strode into the defender's ranks with an air of quiet confidence, and in one fluid motion he struck. His spear darted forward, slicing through the air with impossible precision, as if performing a dance practiced over countless lifetimes. A defender fell, his weapon scattering from his grasp. Another lunged, but the custodian spun, sidestepping effortlessly, a faint smile playing at the edge of his lips. To the defenders of Germany, he appeared as something otherworldly, a being who seemed almost to be savoring the fight as he flowed through their ranks. Where other warriors would strike with brute force, this custodian moved like an artist, each thrust of his spear precise and almost delicate. Galen watched in a mixture of awe and horror as the custodian dispatched his comrades, his expression serene, as though he were simply refining his craft. One of the defenders, a young warrior whose face was hardened by battle, charged the custodian with a defiant shout, swinging a heavy axe. The custodian pivoted, his spear carving a graceful arc through the air, deflecting the attack as if it were a mere formality. With a swift thrust, he pierced the warrior's armor, the blade of his spear emerging clean on the other side. The custodian barely broke his stride, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling joy, as if he were finding beauty in every movement, every strike. Galen took a step back, clutching his weapon tightly, feeling the raw power and precision of the custodian with every movement. This was not a soldier. It was a force beyond anything they could comprehend, something that moved with the certainty of fate itself. And as he watched, Galen realized that in the face of such a being, they were not fighting to survive, but simply to endure for as long as they could. The Golden Warrior moved through the ranks with an elegance that defied the brutality of the battle around him. Adorned in armor that gleamed like molten light, he wielded his spear with a skill that was almost hypnotic. He was not like the Thunder Warriors nor any soldier they had faced. He was something else entirely, something far more refined and terrifying. The defenders stared, transfixed by the sight of this lone figure cutting through their ranks. His spear wove through the air with an otherworldly precision, each strike placed perfectly, each movement smooth and unhurried. For him, the fight seemed more like an art, a practiced form of expression rather than a brutal act of war. Galen could only watch as the Golden Warrior struck down his comrades with an almost playful grace, his spear leaving arcs of light in its wake. What is he? One of the defenders murmured, eyes wide with horror and awe. They had no name for this being, only the unsettling feeling that he was something far beyond them, a creature from myth, a force sent to cleanse. Eliana stood beside Galen, her staff raised, her face set in grim determination as she whispered, "We were never meant to face something like this." Galen tightened his grip on his weapon. "Whatever he is will give him something to remember. For Stahlburg. For Germany." Together, they gathered the last few defenders, forming a tight circle around the inner sanctum. The Golden Warrior paused, his head tilted slightly as he observed them, as though amused by the gathering storm of defiance. Then, with a fluid shift of his stance, he moved in, his spear poised, his golden armor a beacon amid the shadows. Galen raised his weapon, meeting the warrior's gaze with unflinching resolve. They would not survive, but they would leave a mark that even this creature would remember. And with that, the final stand began. The custodian struck with an elegance that bordered on the surreal, his spear a blur as it moved from one defender to the next, each motion efficient, each strike measured. The defenders fell in silence, their resistance meeting the unwavering force of an opponent who seemed as much a force of nature as a warrior. Yet with each step he took, they held their ground, each defender buying precious moments for those who remained. Galen braced himself as the custodian turned to him, spear poised. For an instant, time seemed to slow, and he saw something in the Golden Warrior's eyes, a flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. Then the custodian moved, his spear finding its mark with the same perfect precision that had felled all the others. As Galen fell, the last of Stahlburg's defenders stood their ground, refusing to yield until the very end. When the silence finally settled, the Golden Warrior strode through the aftermath, his steps calm and unhurried. The fortress lay quiet, its defenders' last stand etched into the stone and shadows, a testament to their fierce resolve. His gaze swept the chamber until he noticed movement at the edge of the sanctum. From the darkness, a group of civilians emerged. Women, children, and the elderly who had hidden in fear. They looked upon the custodian with awe and dread, their faces pale, unsure of whether to flee or bow. The custodian regarded them for a moment, his expression unreadable. He spoke, his voice steady and absolute. "People of Germany," he announced, each word carrying the weight of imperial decree, "your leadership has been removed by order of the Emperor. You will now join the Imperium. If you wish to choose one among you to guide this transition, then step forward and name them. If not, I shall choose for you." The civilians exchanged hesitant glances, fear and uncertainty filling their faces. Then, with a steadying breath, an elder stepped forward. His posture was upright, his gaze steady as he met the custodian's eye. "What is your name?" the custodian asked, his tone less a question than a formality. "Cassian Bile," the man replied, his voice firm despite the tension in the room. The custodian inclined his head slightly. "Cassian Bile, by order of the Emperor, you shall serve as imperial commander of this region. You will oversee its people as they enter the Imperium's fold, carrying out its laws and maintaining its order." Cassian held the custodian's gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I accept this duty," he replied, his tone resolute. The custodian nodded, his golden form retreating from the hall, his mission complete. And as the people of Germany gathered around their new leader, the legacy of Stahlburg's final defenders lingered, not as defiance, but as an enduring spirit that would shape their future within the Imperium. The custodian's footsteps faded into the distance, leaving the hall in an uneasy silence. The civilians clustered around Cassian Bile, each one casting uncertain glances at the elder who had been named their new commander. His eyes remained fixed on the empty doorway where the custodian had vanished, his expression solemn and unreadable. The weight of the custodian's mandate hung over him like a cloak, heavy with the unspoken responsibility of guiding Germany's survivors into a future they could not yet imagine. One of the civilians, a woman with soot-streaked cheeks, spoke up, her voice barely a whisper. "What will become of us now, Commander?" Cassian turned to face them, the title feeling strange, almost foreign. For generations, his family had lived and fought in Germany's lands, guided by a pride and loyalty that ran as deep as its mountains. But this was something different, something that would require a strength of a different kind. He looked into their expectant faces, each one reflecting the fear and resilience that had carried them through the siege. "We will survive," Cassian said, his voice calm yet firm. "The Emperor has declared this land a part of his Imperium, and so we will live under his rule. But remember this, the spirit of Germany does not vanish because our walls have fallen." His gaze swept over the room, meeting the eyes of each survivor. "We carry it with us, here," he said, pressing a hand to his heart. "So long as we remember those who fell, we remain true to what we were." The survivors nodded, some straightening, finding a new purpose in his words. They knew they could never rebuild Stahlburg as it had been, nor erase the memory of the golden warrior who had walked through their defenses like a wraith. But Cassian's words kindled something within them, a sense that they could honor what they had lost, even as they began anew. As dawn broke over the ruined walls of Stahlburg, the people of Germany gathered in the shadow of what remained of their fortress. Under Cassian's guidance, they began the arduous task of preparing for the future, the memory of their fallen defenders, and the final stand they had made woven into the foundation of what would come next. And in the quiet hours of that morning, they laid to rest the weapons of their fallen, a silent tribute to those who had given everything. In that moment, Germany was reborn, not as a fortress, but as a memory, an indomitable spirit that would endure, carried forward by those who survived. Under Cassian Bile's leadership, the survivors of Germany gathered their strength, preparing for the new life that awaited them within the Imperium's fold. In the days that followed, they took to the old rituals one last time, marking the stones of Stahlburg with the symbols of their heritage before abandoning the ruins. Cassian led them away, carrying with him the weight of Germany's legacy, a torch passed down from the defenders who had held the line. As the people journeyed toward a future shaped by the Emperor's rule, word spread of what had happened at Stahlburg. Stories emerged, a golden warrior who fought with an elegance beyond mortal means, the fierce defiance of Germany's last stand, and the spirit of a people who refused to yield, even in the face of the impossible. Whispers traveled far and wide, reaching the ears of those who might one day be Germany's allies or enemies. And on the eastern horizon, another power was stirring. The Empire of Ursh, the largest and fiercest of Terra's factions, watched the Emperor's expansion with wary eyes. Their warlords were powerful and cunning, ruling over a land of conquest and domination. If Germany had fallen, then Ursh knew its own fate would not be far behind. The Emperor's vision was growing clearer, and the world would soon realize that his dream of unity would come at a price that only the strongest could pay. If you want to see how Ursh, Terra's largest and most feared empire, will respond to the Emperor's march, stay tuned for the next chapter. Subscribe and join us as we delve into the battles, intrigues, and power struggles that await in the heart of Ursh's war-torn lands.